Arrin Sutliff creates site-specific and time-based work using plants, flowers, and digital media. Based in DC, Arrin is the owner of Tint, Floral, which focuses on design for weddings and events. Informed by the season, she relies on local growers and nurseries for blooms and foliage. Over to you, Arrin.
Hello, everyone. I'm excited what we have to get into today, so we'll just get started because Elizabeth already did the intro. I'm going to start with 3 different wiring methods. And the first one, well, first, I guess I'll say why we might wire something. So generally you wire something if a stem might be broken and it needs to be wired. Maybe you want to change the orientation of the stem. So if this were the stem, I had already wired this one, but if this were the stem and it was going dead straight, maybe I want it to have a little bend to it. So now that I've wired it, I can kind of change its position. So if this were a boutonniere, instead of a flower that might be facing straight up, I could have it bend a little bit forward or a little bit to the side. And so you have a lot of flexibility when you wire stems. The one thing that happens when you wire a stem is that it no longer has access to a water source. So you can't just go ahead and wire everything, but I will show you towards the end of the program how to care for things that no longer have a water source. I would say when I use wiring the most, it is in wearables. And so that is what we were going to talk about today. But you can also apply wiring to arrangements. Let's say you have like grasses that don't need a water source and you want to wire in grasses so they face a certain way into your arrangements. That would be a really good use of wiring as well. So 3 main wiring methods that I tend to use is first the U method. So the U method is generally used on something that has kind of a flat face. I'll show you what I mean by that. It's what I use to wire this one. And so when I mean a flat face, it's kind of like flat on top. It's not a cone coming up. And so the way I would wire it is I'll cut off the stem. And I'll just go ahead and I'll cut this stem really short. I don't need this stem on here anymore because I want the wire to be able to move the face of this flower as much as possible. So I'm just going to get rid of this. I will say another reason, this stem, this is a butterfly ranunculus, and this stem happens to be really tiny. But one of the other main reasons that I wire flowers is to reduce bulk. So if you're making a boutonniere and you have a stem, let's say this allium. This allium has a really thick stem. I personally wouldn't even use this whole flower just because it's too big, but pretend this has a smaller face. You don't want that, like these heavy stems on someone's like silk dress that the pin might kind of want to pull out or something like that. So reducing bulk is another reason you might wire. This doesn't really happen much these days anymore, but people used to wire bouquets so that the bride who's holding the bouquet just has like the smallest little handle, even though the bouquet is massive. You don't really see that too much these days. It's very time consuming, but it is really cool. The bride just has this like super light bouquet to hang around and it'll last the entirety of the event. So the first method I'm going to show you is this U method for flat face flowers. So I have a piece of wire here. Always use your wire cutters. Never use your flower shears to cut the wire or you'll get little nicks in your shears and they won't cut as well. So I'm cutting a piece about this long and I'm going to make a U shape. Some people call this the hairpin method. And then the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to put the U on either side of the center. See if I can get this in the camera for you. And then when it comes out, it'll be on either side of the stem. You just push it all the way through. And you see it just kind of disappears in the top. So now my stem is wired, but it's kind of not super sturdy when I just have the wire. So that's where you come in with the stem tape. Stem tape, if you've never used it before, to touch it, it's not sticky at all. So if I pull this out and I like touch it to my face, like it's just gonna fall off. It's not sticky. But when you stretch it, it becomes sticky. So there are two ways you could use stem tape. The one way, not the way that I use, but a lot of people do, is to stretch it first. So you stretch it first and then you wrap it around the stem. The way that I like to do it just feels a little bit, I feel like I'm a little bit more in control this way, is to start with it regular. And I'm putting it right at the base of the stem. The first couple times you go around are a little tricky. You'll just get used to it as you go. But I'm kind of just stretching it. Each time I turn it, I'm stretching it ever so slightly. So every time I turn, this thumb is just kind of stretching it. So now I have this nice wired ranunculus that can move in all sorts of shapes. And if it were a really thick stem, it would reduce a lot of bulk. The next method I'm going to show you is the pierce method. So the pierce method is generally used for something that has a long calyx. So when I say calyx, I mean this thing at the back, like at the base of the flower. So think of a rose, it has that long calyx. Let's see if I have a butterfly ranunculus that I didn't cut. Well, you can kind of even see it here. If I show you this butterfly ranunculus that we just did, if I take these little, you see it doesn't have anything I could really poke into. It doesn't really have that long calyx like this one does. So when it has this sturdy calyx, you can use what's called the pierce method. Again, I'm just going to cut this down. I don't need this stem anymore. And I'm going to take my wire again. Usually I use 24 to 26 gauge wire. That's just a nice thickness, in my opinion. You could see what works best for you, but 24 to 26 generally always does what I want it to do. So for the pierce method, exactly like it sounds, you pierce the calyx. So I'm going through, and now I have this funny looking thing, and then you're making the U from here. So then I'm just taking it and I'm bending it down. So I've kind of just made that same U that we did in the other one, but instead of pulling it through the face of the flower, I'm piercing the calyx and then bending it down. And then you do the same thing with the tape. I always take the tape off of the roll first. I've tried to keep it on the roll so I know exactly how much I need, and it just, the roll just gets in my way. So I find it's much easier to work with if I just take a piece off first. One thing I didn't note last time is I'm kind of angling down as I go, because if you don't angle down, you're just going to keep taping around in the same spot. So the more you're able to kind of angle down, the less times you'll have to turn around. And it'll make the whole process much quicker. So now we have these two so far. And then this is one of my favorite methods. The next method is called the crank method. And for the crank method, I'll actually use this allium. I think hopefully this will hold up on me. And if not, we'll learn together. But this allium personally is just way too big to put on a wearable, in my opinion. So what I would probably do is just take some of these off. I'm just gonna, so now I have this grouping. They're all separate. I'm not going to take them apart because they're kind of sticking together right now, and that's to my benefit. But these are all little separate filaments. Like each one of these is a separate stem. If I take the wire and I try to wire this immediately, these are so soft that the wire is just going to rip through them. So what I will do first is I'll take a piece of tape and I'll just tape these together. This piece of tape is way too long because I'm not going down so far this time. I'm just going around. So now that I've taped them together, this is kind of protecting all those little soft stems. And then I can take my piece of wire, you put it across like this. It kind of looks like the pierce method, but I'm just setting it on top, and then I'm cranking it. So just going around a couple times and then bending this down. It looks a little wonky right now, but once I tape it, you'll see it'll clean it right up. This floral tape, it's called stem tape, so you now get the reason why it's called stem tape. There's other floral tape called that's more of like, it's thin. It kind of feels like duct tape, but it's really thin. You can use that to wrap bouquets, and you can use it to keep chicken wire in an arrangement. But just know there's a big difference between stem tape and the other floral tape that is actually like sticky to the touch. And now if I wanted to put this in a boutonniere, it's like much more manageable, and it gives this like little nice, beautiful pop of purple without having, like, I'll show you what it was before. Like, this is not going to work, but this is just I can still use big things and kind of use them in this small way. I do this a lot with grasses. So if I'm wiring grasses in an arrangement, I might wire a bunch of pieces of grasses together, because if you're foraging grasses and you have all these single blades, it's really hard to design with them when you're sticking in just one blade at a time. So what I might do in an arrangement is take a bunch of blades of grass together, and use stem tape to tape them up. And then maybe I'll add some wire to it, and then I can use that clump of grasses in an arrangement. And usually grasses can do pretty well without water. So those are the three main methods. And before I move on, Elizabeth, any questions about those methods?
No specific questions yet, so I think keep on going, and audience members, get your questions ready.
Yeah, feel free. Elizabeth will pass them on. So if you have any questions, please type them in the chat. Okay, so we've gotten a couple wire methods down. This isn't necessary to making a boutonniere. I think I probably made tons of boutonnieres without using wiring at all. But like I said, it does reduce that bulk, which is really nice. But sometimes you really don't need it. And so let's say I have small stems. The way that you would generally make a boutonniere is by breaking down a bunch of small stems. So just so I could show you what this looks like before, this is 9 bark. And so I might just take a little piece of 9 bark off to the side. Usually when I'm doing any sort of wearables, I like to break down a bunch of pieces kind of before I get started. It's just easier form of workflow to break it down versus like grabbing the stem, cutting off one piece, adding it to the boutonniere, and then you're trying to hold the boutonniere while you're trying to like cut off a little piece. So it's nice to kind of have a whole slew. You can see I already prepped a bunch of them. I have all these little pieces, like this little teeny butterfly ranunculus, little pieces of 9 bark. I have some columbine, which is one of my favorite spring perennials that I just think everyone should grow. It comes in a lot of different colors. This one honestly kind of, I'm blanking on the name of the flower that it looks like right now, but here's a better example of what columbine looks like. These are both the same. This one just kind of looks more like a traditional columbine. But so usually I just break a bunch of these up into small little pieces, so I kind of have this buffet to work with. And then I usually just choose a flower that I really like. Like, I think this butterfly ranunculus is just a really pretty muddy color, so I'm going to use this. It has a pretty small stem, So I don't think I'll go ahead and wire this. I'll just kind of keep it as is. And then I'll just add to that. I always think when I'm making boutonnieres, I think about layering. So I'm coming in and just, you're kind of making a teeny little bouquet in your hand. So I'll actually use the allium that we wired together. The nice thing about this allium is I'm going to be able to adjust the way that this face is. Like if I feel like it needs to go back a little bit. When you do have stuff wired, you just have so much more control. I'm going to put one of these little pieces of foliage, and notice that I removed all of the foliage from the bottom. The reason that you do that is the same reason that you might wire a flower. Like you just want to reduce any bulk that isn't necessary. So where you're kind of grabbing this bouquet, you want it to be as thin as possible. So I'll add some foliage. Maybe I'll grab some 9 bark. And where my finger is where I'm going to want to come in with the tape later. And while with arrangements, it's kind of the opposite. I'm usually like, okay, as soon as you think you're done with an arrangement, stop. Like, don't keep stuffing it. It's kind of the opposite for me, at least for boutonnieres. I kind of am in the mindset where if you think you're done, think about layering just like 1 or 2 more things, because all of these little teeny textures, like they really look cool. And so you could always remove them after if you don't like them, but I like to kind of layer as much as I can. So once I kind of think it's done, I go ahead and I layer a couple more. This ranunculus that we did, to be honest, I think this is a little big for my taste in the boutonniere, but maybe we can add. As you can see, I really like teeny little bits. And the cool thing is even if you have big flowers like the allium, you can break stuff down and make it small. So I'll go ahead now. I think I'll put a little more foliage on this side. See what I mean? It's like if I had this broken down, it's just, it's less of a balancing game in your hand. And then I'll come in and I'll grab a piece of tape. And I'll tape that right, you don't want it to splay apart. So if I tape it down here below my thumb, everywhere it's just going to kind of like come apart more than I want. And so my goal is to tape it right where my thumb is. So kind of just like we prepped the crank method, that's what we're doing with this. We're not actually going to go ahead and do the crank method on this, but I am just going to make sure I have this secure with wire. So now I have all these like funny looking long stems, and I'll just go and I'll cut these down to right below the tape. And then now I have this adorable little boutonniere. And then from there, if you were going to be wearing this or giving this to someone, you can always, I'm not a huge fan, this is very subjective, so you can look up tons of ways to add ribbon to these. If I'm adding ribbon at all, a lot of times I just like to cut the stems really close to under the tape and just pin it on, and then the ribbon isn't a focal point. But if you do want to go ahead and add ribbon, you can either wrap the ribbon all the way down the stem, or you can just take a small like 1/8 inch, 1/4 inch ribbon and just tie it right in the center. And then you would take 2 pins, stick it in, and the boutonniere is ready to go. So I guess I'll tell you Well, one thing that I noticed I was doing that I wanted to mention is when I am ripping the tape, it's for me, at least originally, it was kind of intuitive to kind of like rip the tape. And that rip actually worked pretty well, but sometimes when you do it, it kind of stretches it in that area. And so what I find the best way, the cleanest way to rip tape is actually to hold it on two sides and just pull it. And then the end just ends up getting this really nice clean cut. You can also cut it with scissors, which gives it a really nice clean cut as well, as you see. But usually I don't have enough hands for all of that. So just kind of pulling it taut outwards is generally the way that I like to cut it.
Arrin, you talked a little bit about wiring grasses.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk more about why? So I think of grasses as being quite narrow stemmed. And if we're thinking about wiring as a way to reduce bulk, can you talk a little bit more about why you would choose to wire them and how?
So reducing bulk is just one of the reasons you might do it. So in a boutonniere, I don't want to have, I'm not trying to have bulk, but in an arrangement, it doesn't really matter. Like, actually, I might even want bulk. For example, if I'm using a flower frog, so I'm kind of holding my stems that I'm using for this class right now in this flower frog. If you have a really thin stem and you're trying to stick it into a flower frog, it might go between the pins and just kind of fall over. It also won't really look natural. Like, grasses kind of grow together in these nice clumps. And so if you just have, like in an arrangement, if you just have one teeny stem of grass here, one teeny, like that would look fine. But what I might like to do is to take a bunch, let me see, I don't have exactly what I'm talking about, but I have a couple stems over there. I might be able to show you something. Give me 1 second. Okay, so this is actually a pretty good example. This troll grass, these are actually all single strands. And so the way that these are tied with just some like really thin string, because I got these at the wholesaler like this. But normally, like if I were to cut these, like if I were just to cut a bunch of grasses, what I would do is I would tape these together, because if I just tried to stick all these individual strands in an arrangement, like I wouldn't really have a lot of control. That said, if I have 3 of these bunches, I might even take all 3 of them and just want it to be like, I want them to all get placed kind of together in this arrangement. And so what I might do is take the tape and tape all of these together. And then I might even go further with the crank method, take my piece of wire, and this would be, if I were doing this for arrangement, my wire would be a lot longer, but I would take my piece of wire, I would do this crank method where I'm going around. So this is not so much for wearables. I'll give you an example of how you might do it with wearables as well. But now I can stick this in the arrangement. I didn't even necessarily have to wire this, but if I want it to be taller, then I have to wire it. And now I can kind of like stick this in an arrangement all together, instead of originally these started out just as individual strands.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah.
As we're thinking about, it seems like you might have been about to dive into sort of preserving things and how you're keeping them. So this is a question a little bit in that vein. Somebody wants to put wild blueberries in wearables for a wedding, but they're worried about stains, getting on blouses, lapels. Do you have any workarounds for staining? And as a follow-up to that, are there any particular things you work with where staining is likely a problem?
I definitely know. I remember one thing. I kind of just knew when I was working with it, it wasn't going to be a good situation. And so I just avoided it, because I'm not I do not want to get anyone's outfit stained. That would be terrible. So I honestly would probably try to avoid it. With blueberries though, I think if you get them when they're like, if you're getting wild blueberries, I'm assuming you're kind of foraging for them, or they're growing in your yard or something. I think you can get them at that stage where they're still not fully ripe and they're kind of like greenish but have hints of purple, which I think actually would be really beautiful. A lot of times, like the reason I like this one ranunculus flower so much is because it has kind of like multiple like shades in it, and I think that would be a really beautiful thing if you had the blueberry that kind of went from like green to some dark purples but wasn't fully ripe. So I think you can get away with it with that. You just wouldn't be able to use like super ripe ones, because I have used unripe blackberries in wearables before, but yeah, never ripe, just because the color is a concern. I know some people forage for like pokeberry in the summertime, and while it like looks awesome in an arrangement, like it can definitely stain. So you do kind of want to avoid that, because people are going to be giving them hugs. Like you kind of just have to anticipate the worst, and you don't want that person, like the ultimate thing is you want that person to really enjoy their event. And so if they're really worried about like getting their outfit stained the whole time, I think I would be concerned with that. But I think the wild blueberries is an awesome idea if they were not as ripe. And then in terms of care, we'll talk about care a little bit. So it's very rare for me to have like an actual boutonniere box. I just happen to have this around. So oftentimes I just use those, you know, the Tupperware containers that they give out, like if you get like a small soup at a restaurant or something. A lot of times I just use those, or I use Ziploc bags. You just need something that like seals. And honestly, this boutonniere box, it doesn't even seal. It's like there's a lot of air that comes through, but see, it just connects here and here. So it's not perfectly sealed, but it'll get the job done. So the way that you want to care for these pieces is by taking whatever you're going to be putting them in. Take a piece of paper towel. And this is the best method I found. I know you've probably heard of things like crowning glory, things that you might spray on them that kind of keeps the moisture inside. And while they might work, I've used them before, and I just think this is like hands down the best method. And every time I do it, I'm shocked every time at how good the flowers look. Like these flowers look fine right now, and I promise you that tomorrow when I pull them out of the fridge, they're going to look better. And so the fact that they look better and not worse, like I just think this is the best method. And I've done a lot of this. So I basically spray the paper towel with water. The reason the paper towel is here, you don't just want to put the thing in here and spray it, because then water sits directly on the petals and has nowhere to go. And so it might cause the petals to kind of get like a little crepe-like. You might have seen that happen before, even with flowers that you have growing in your yard. Once it rains, the petals kind of get a little textured and somewhat see-through. And so that normally doesn't look good. So that's why you add the paper towel. And then I will spray it a little bit on top. But then again, I'm going to put another paper towel, spray that. So the paper towel will like pull up most of the moisture and not really allow the water to do too much like sitting right on the flowers. And then you just close that up. If it's a Ziploc bag, zip it up. Let's say you're doing like a full flower crown, or even like I said, that bridal bouquet that's wired. Like obviously you don't have a soup container that will fit your bridal bouquet. So how do you go about that? Usually I would just use like a big plastic bag, like a bread. I have these big plastic bags that I use to proof sourdough. And I usually will just put the bouquet in a vase so it's standing up, even if it doesn't have water in it, because the flowers don't have stems, so they have no way of drinking water. So I'll put the bouquet, and then I'll spray the bouquet with water, and then inside this big this big plastic bag, I'll put some more paper towels, spray them with water, and then I'll just staple the bag shut. And then I'll stick that in the fridge. You do want to stick it in the fridge because you don't want the flowers to like be able to get mold or anything. Like you want to put them in the cooler as soon as you're done making this. And then I would say usually you want to make the piece a day before, because you want them to really be able to get fully hydrated. So if I had an event tonight, I would ideally have made this yesterday so they have the whole night in the fridge to really like drink up all of that water and just get really plump so that they last the entirety of an event. And I'm surprised a lot of times, like flowers that even have a difficult time hydrating in water with the stem, this method, like really, I've just seen things last for like 6 to 8 hours at an event and not wilt at all with this method. I see a lot of people try to skip this method where they just make boutonnieres with flowers that tend to be more sturdy and maybe don't need as much care. But 3 hours into the event, that like spray rose that you used is like on that person's chest, and it's just kind of like sadly wilted over. And so this is going to set you up for the most amount of success. If you're out in the sun, it's like the middle of July. I'm in DC right now. It's like 90 something degrees right now. If you're outside in that sort of heat, you just have to expect that at some point it might give out. If it's like super, super hot, but for the most part, these hold up pretty well. And you would do the same for any type of floral jewelry, anything that doesn't have a stem. The reason that I talked about grasses in arrangements is because I'm obviously like putting my arrangement on display for many days. So I'm not really going to be able to just wire flowers into that, and because they won't have a water source. And so usually when I'm using wiring in an arrangement, it's generally for either grasses or things that are dried.
Is preservation the reason you don't tape the entire stem part of the boutonniere?
No, I just think it looks a little more natural, like to have like a little stems out versus like a really thick stem wrap. But everyone does it a little bit differently. That's just my personal preference. I think I think aesthetically it looks a little bit better. But your boutonniere really isn't going to be drinking much from the stem. So if you wrap the whole thing, they're really, with this method, that you're kind of wetting these paper towels, they're kind of drinking from the petals and the leaves themselves. So if you cover this bottom up, that's totally fine.
What is the limit of how far in advance you can prepare the bouquet or the boutonniere?
So I've only tested it out 2 days in advance. It's pretty crazy though, because sometimes I'll wear something, like I'll make something for myself. I'll wear like a wrist corsage or something just to an event, and then I just can't bring myself to throwing it out quite yet because I really like it, and I get home from the event, it still looks good. So I'll stick it back in the fridge, and I've pulled it out like a week later, and sometimes it looks good. So I think you should play around with it and see. Just to be safe, because I would do it 1 or 2 days before, but this method of hydration actually works really well. I would say probably up to a week would be okay, but test it out.
Okay, now on the other end of the spectrum, somebody's got a party tonight in DC and plans to wear flowers. They're planning to pick them from the garden. Is it better to pick now in the heat of day and give them time to rehydrate in the fridge, or better to wait and pick tonight when it's cooler but won't really have time to rehydrate?
Okay, whoever asked this question, I have so much respect for you. This is such a good question. It's like, so I would say yes. Like generally, I would tell you harvest either in the morning or at night, because in the heat of the day, flowers are pretty stressed, and so it's better to harvest then. But the fact that it's tonight, I would probably get out there, cut them now. And as you saw with this, right now I have these just in a little bit of water so that I can do this class. But if I had something tonight, what I would do is I would cut all of these little prep pieces, and then I would put in the Tupperware container, I'd put a layer of paper towel. I would spray that, put the prepped pieces, spray those, put a paper towel, spray that, and then cover the Tupperware container. And then that, I think, is going to give you like the best hydration in a short amount of time that will prep you for tonight. And then when you take it out, everything will be as good of hydration as it can be in that amount of time. And I think you'll have success for sure.
And so the opposite of hydrating, if you want to dry your wearables for longer term preservation, can you talk a little bit about the best way to do that?
Yeah, I'm not a big dried flower person, but I do know that, like, okay, are you trying to make this is important. Are you trying to make the boutonniere and then dry it to like have as a memory thing? Or are you trying to dry flowers and then have and then make the boutonniere?
While the person who asked that question gives us the additional information, I can also offer a plug for another previously recorded garden program, which was way back in the beginning of us doing these. We did an herbarium specimen class where we were talking about pressed plants. And so that's, when I personally have dried plants, I've done a lot of pressing plants. So then you probably wouldn't wear most of the pressed things, but I can use them for artistic purposes and create arrangements and that sort of thing. So you can, if you're interested in learning more about how to successfully press plants and keep up with the beautiful colors as much as possible, you can check out that program. And I've got clarity on the original question. And really, they're asking for the best way to dry a bouquet, if you have opinions on that.
Yeah, and I honestly have never, I'm not big into that. I know there's a lot of information online, but I would say generally it's out of water and in a space that I know you don't want a lot of sunlight. And I would definitely look into it, because sometimes the flowers have some hydration and they might mold if they're too close together. Like, I know sometimes if I'm just picking flowers and drying them, if I don't dry them in small enough bunches, then sometimes there's mold in the center because there's not enough airflow. It's not something I have a lot of experience with in terms of drying the actual either wearable or the bouquet. But I do know that is one thing to definitely look out for, is like you want there to be airflow around the space, because the consideration, I think, is you just don't want it to be mold. Okay, so if you have more questions, continue to ask. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to continue to make little bunches. So I'm going to make like a small little hairpiece, which if I continue to make that hairpiece and made it longer, it would be a full flower crown. But what I'm going to do is, so I've taken this ranunculus that I wired, and I've taken the 9 bark and a little piece of columbine, and I'm just going to take all of these little things I've prepped and make like 4 or 5 small bundles. And so once you make a boutonniere, you can make a really beautiful flower crown. You basically have the same exact skills. You just need more of them. When you do have the wired pieces in here, I usually just cut, if I have a wired one in there, I just cut everything off with the wire cutters, because I am not interested in damaging my clippers. I've said that before, but it can never be said enough. It's so frustrating when you go to cut a stem and it just kind of crushes the stem instead of cutting it. Also, like you really don't want to crush your stems with dull clippers, because then they can't drink as well. For what we're doing right now, it doesn't really matter because they're not drinking through the stem anyway. But Oh, I love this blocks over here. Blocks. So again, I'm just by where my thumb is, I'm removing all the foliage in there so it's nice and clean. And I would say if you're new to this and you want to test it out, a good way to kind of get a good handle on how a lot of things works is to just go to the store or go to the farmer's market and get a mixed bouquet. But look for one especially that has a lot of texture. Like you can see, all of these are small little bits of texture. So I guess we'll start with 3. And so what I'm going to do to make this hairpiece, if I were doing a flower crown, what I would probably do is just kind of twist these 2 together and then make a size that was suitable for my head with the wire. But what I'm going to be doing with this, because I'm just making a small little hairpiece that I might put a bobby pin on one side and another side to hold it up, I'm going to put this in, I'm going to fold this in half. Just makes it a little bit thicker. And then I'll make a little loop on the end here. Like that. And then from the other side, honestly, the other side already has a loop. Yeah, I'll just leave that. That'll work. Normally I put a loop on both sides, but that loop is perfectly fine. So let's see if that's a good size. A little big. Okay, I'll make the loop because it does seem a little big. So now I have a loop on both sides. The worst thing in the world is to get these small wires on the end to get stuck in your hair. So again, just to kind of clean up that wire, I am going to tape the center of this. That way this part where the little wires were exposed is covered up. Okay, so now I've made this like kind of like, the idea is to put a bobby pin through this loop and this loop. And then I'll have just a small little hairpiece. So the way I'm going to do this, you can do this with wire or, let me grab my screwdriver. You do this with wire or tape. I generally just prefer wire. This is my wire on a spool, which is the same as this other wire. I just have some pieces cut straight already because it's easier to work with. This is the same stuff. It's just on a spool, and sometimes it's easier for me to work with. This is the same as wreath making as well. You make these little bundles. It's the same thing. So I'm going to attach my wire to my hairpiece first, and then I'll add my boutonniere or my bundle, and I'll wrap that around. And see why it's important that we tape them? Like, obviously we tape them because of the bundles, but also if I just bundled these in my hand and put them on and they were really soft stems, the wire might just chop through the stems when I was turning it around. So the tape is helpful there. And now I'll come in and I'll put my next little bundle, just covering up the kind of like mechanics of the previous bundle. And then I put my next bundle, holding it here, wiring that on. Looks like I'm going to need one more bundle to kind of finish that out. There's the top so you can see. So come over to my little pieces. And the amount of stems in these bundles, it really just depends on how you want how big you want the hairpiece to be. Usually I would say I put like 3 to 5 stems. And if you just think of that like boutonniere, if you're just making a boutonniere, it's generally just like a little boutonniere is made into a hairpiece. So you can always hold it up and see like, okay, do I like this? Is it way too thick? Whatever. So I'll take this last piece and I'll tape it. Again, right where my thumb is, just kind of replacing where I'm holding it. I'm going to do one more just because I think I want to, actually, it seems like it'll do it. All right, we'll see. So for the last one, usually I would do it in the opposite direction because I don't want the end to just have stems sticking out of it. It's a little hard to see on screen, but if this were my end, you would see stems sticking out. Sometimes it's subtle, or I can even kind of place it down and you won't notice. But you can either put the last piece on kind of with the stems going in. So you're going the same direction through the entire flower crown or the entire hairpiece or the entire wreath, whatever you're doing. And then for the very last one, if it makes sense, you can go in the opposite direction. And then to tie that off, I'm going to come to the back, just clip the wire. So this is what it looks like now. I put my wire off. You've noticed that I never removed my wire the whole time. So it's just it's a ton of work to just wire and then cut off and then wire and then cut off because you have to do that attachment for each time. And that's the longest part of making these. And yes, I see in the chat, Anna says, is this the same technique to make a crown? Exactly. So if this were a crown, this would just be a lot longer. And same with a wreath. Like if you're making a winter wreath, it's the same thing. The difference is you would either, for a wreath, you'd be doing this on a frame instead of like this small little piece of wire that I'm making this on, because everything's just like much heavier and you want the circle to stay the same. And the difference if you're doing a flower crown is you're either making it a full circle or with these little loops that I made on the end. Like let's say this were longer and I had the loops on the end, you could just put a piece of ribbon in the back and connect the two loops. And then it's adjustable, which is really nice. Yeah, you can see like now I can just put this here with a couple bobby pins if I wanted to just have like a smaller hairpiece. But if it were longer, this is kind of what it would look like as a crown. And you can do this with dried flowers as well. Same thing, you kind of want to tape them first. Like dried flowers are just brittle, so if you're trying to make these bundles and put them directly onto your frame, which in this case was just our wire that we were using, then, sorry, I just lost my train of thought. Elizabeth, what was I? Sorry, guys, I just lost my train of thought. If someone wants to pick up in the chat, I can't.
No worries at all. There's a great suggestion in the chat, looking like you could use hair decoration for a wrist bouquet. So yes. It really looks like an adaptable technique.
Yes, that's a good way to actually demonstrate what it would look like as a crown. So, or how you would do it as a crown. So you would just kind of bend this down. And so now it's kind of like this wrist piece. And the way that you would attach the bottom is you remember, it's hard to see, there were these two loops on the end. So you just stick one piece of ribbon through there and then tie a little bow. So yeah, super versatile. Also, I was talking about like the frame. So you could also use, I'm doing this on wire, but like, let's say you have a bangle or something, you can do this right onto a bangle. or something like that. Or if you have a necklace, let's say that is like structured, you could do it right onto a necklace. You can just kind of make these small little bundles and then wire them on.
Amazing.
It's a super, super useful tool. Wire kind of fixes everything. Like I would never, even if I had no intention of using wire in something I was making, I kind of always have it around because I never know like how it's going to come into play. A lot of times it kind of saves the day.
Goodness. Well, that seems like the perfect ending note.